Hey there, storytellers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain hammered against the mountainside like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding into mist as it struck the rocky slopes of Blue Ridge Valley. Emma Collins pressed herself deeper into the shallow cave she'd discovered, her wedding dress now torn and mud-stained. The delicate silk that had cost her father a fortune reduced to tattered remnants clinging to her shivering frame. The storm had come from nowhere, transforming the mountain trail from a manageable path into a treacherous maze of rushing water and loose stone. She had been running for 2 days now, fleeing the life that had been planned for her, the marriage to William Ashford that would seal her fate as surely as a coffin lid. The arranged union was her father's final business transaction, trading his daughter's freedom for social standing and financial security. Emma had endured the engagement parties, the dress fittings, the endless discussions of wedding arrangements, all while her soul withered like a flower in winter. When the final moment arrived, when she stood at the back of Richmond's grandest church with her hand on her father's arm, something inside her had simply snapped. The memory of her escape still burned vivid in her mind. The shocked gasps of the congregation as she lifted her skirts and ran down the church aisle, not toward the altar but toward the doors, her veil streaming behind her like a banner of rebellion. William's face had been a mask of humiliation and rage, her father's a portrait of apoplectic fury. The social scandal would reverberate through Richmond society for years, but Emma had been beyond caring. Freedom called to her with a voice more compelling than any wedding vow. Her brother Thomas had written months ago, describing his new life in the Blue Ridge Valley, where a man could build something with his own hands and live by his own choices. The letter had been her salvation, a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Thomas would understand, would protect her from the consequences of her rebellion. All she had to do was reach his farm in the valley below, but the mountains had other plans. The storm intensified, lightning illuminating the cave's rough walls in stark, terrifying detail. Emma's teeth chattered uncontrollably, her body heat leaching away into the cold stone. Her thin shoes, designed for church aisles rather than mountain trails, had long since fallen apart, leaving her feet bloodied and raw. The small bag of supplies she'd managed to grab before fleeing was soaked through, the bread reduced to paste, the dried meat spoiled by moisture. Thunder rolled across the peaks like the voice of an angry god, and Emma pressed her hands to her ears, tears mixing with the rainwater that dripped steadily from her hair. She had never felt so alone, so utterly abandoned by the world. In Richmond, she had been surrounded by servants, protected by wealth and status, insulated from the harsh realities that now threatened to claim her life. The mountains cared nothing for her privileged upbringing, showed no mercy for her inexperience with survival. A sound reached her through the storm's fury, different from the constant drum of rain and rumble of thunder. Emma lifted her head, straining to hear over the tempest's voice. There it was again, a rhythmic thudding that might have been hoofbeats on stone. Hope flared in her chest, desperate and painful. Perhaps a traveler, someone who could guide her to safety, to Thomas, and the new life she'd sacrificed everything to reach. The sound grew closer, accompanied now by the jingle of metal on leather, the snort of a horse pushed hard through difficult terrain. Emma crept to the cave's mouth, peering out into the gray curtain of rain. Through the downpour, she made out a figure on horseback, a man wrapped in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low against the storm. He rode with the confidence of someone who knew these mountains intimately, his horse picking its way carefully along the treacherous path. "Help!" Emma called, her voice barely audible above the storm. "Please, I need help." The rider pulled up sharply, his head turning toward the sound of her voice. For a moment, Emma thought he might ride on, dismissing her cry as a trick of the wind. Then he dismounted, leading his horse toward the cave with purposeful strides that spoke of a man accustomed to making quick decisions in dangerous situations. As he approached, Emma could see him more clearly. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements economical and sure despite the treacherous footing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked with lines that spoke of hardship and loss. Dark hair showed beneath his hat, streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, when they met hers, held a depth of sadness that resonated with her own desperate situation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that somehow carried clearly through the storm's chaos. "You're in a poor place to weather this blow." Emma stepped forward, conscious of how she must appear, a bedraggled woman in ruined finery, as out of place in these mountains as a hothouse flower in a blizzard. "I was traveling to the valley," she explained, her voice shaking with cold and exhaustion. "The storm caught me, and I've been lost for hours." The man's eyes took in her torn dress, her bleeding feet, the obvious signs of someone who had been pushed beyond her limits. Something shifted in his expression, a recognition perhaps of suffering that matched his own. "This storm's going to get worse before it gets better," he said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Cave's not going to protect you if the creek rises much more." As if to emphasize his point, a flash flood roared past the cave mouth, carrying debris and loose rocks in its muddy torrent. Emma pressed herself against the back wall, suddenly understanding how precarious her shelter truly was. The man watched the water for a moment, calculating, then turned back to her with decision written in every line of his body. "My cabin's about a mile up the ridge," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm's increasing fury. "It's safe, dry, and warm. I can take you there until this passes." Emma hesitated, every lesson about strange men and proper behavior, warring with the reality of her situation. But as another surge of floodwater crashed past the cave, carrying a full-grown tree in its grip, propriety seemed less important than survival. "I would be grateful," she said, moving toward him with unsteady steps. The man nodded and helped her from the cave, his hands strong and steady as he guided her to his horse. The animal was a sturdy mountain-bred creature, calm despite the storm's violence, obviously well-trained and trustworthy. "Can you ride?" he asked, and when Emma nodded, he lifted her onto the saddle with surprising gentleness, his touch impersonal, but somehow comforting. He swung up behind her, his arms coming around to take the reins, and Emma found herself surrounded by warmth and strength for the first time in days. The man's presence was oddly reassuring, despite her complete ignorance of his identity or intentions. There was something about his quiet competence, his immediate response to her need, that spoke of fundamental decency. They rode in silence. Through the storm, the horse picking its way carefully up a trail that seemed barely passable even in good weather. Emma clung to the saddle horn, acutely aware of the man behind her, of the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing. It had been so long since she'd felt protected, since someone had taken charge of her welfare without demanding something in return. The cabin materialized out of the storm like something from a fairy tale, a solid structure of hewn logs nestled among towering pines. Smoke rose from its chimney, speaking of warmth and shelter, of refuge from the mountain's violence. The man dismounted first, then lifted Emma down with the same careful gentleness he'd shown before, his hands lingering for just a moment to ensure she was steady on her feet. "Wait here," he said, leading his horse to a lean-to shelter attached to the cabin's side. Emma watched him work with efficient movements, unsaddling the animal, providing feed and water, performing the essential tasks of a man who understood that in the mountains, caring for your horse might mean the difference between life and death. When he finished, he returned to her side, guiding her toward the cabin door with a light touch on her elbow. "It's not much," he said, almost apologetically, "but it's dry and warm." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of the cabin was a revelation, simply furnished but scrupulously clean, with a fire crackling cheerfully in a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. Emma stepped inside, feeling warmth begin to penetrate her chilled bones for the first time in hours. The space was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a main room containing a table and chairs, a kitchen area with a well-maintained stove, and what appeared to be a sleeping loft accessible by a ladder in one corner. "Sit by the fire," the man instructed, removing his wet coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "I'll get you something dry to wear and some hot food." Emma sank into a chair before the fireplace, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The warmth was almost painful after the prolonged cold, causing her to shiver more violently as circulation returned to her extremities. She watched her rescuer move about the cabin with practiced ease, preparing coffee on the stove, gathering blankets from a wooden chest. It was only as he turned toward her, a dry shirt and pair of trousers in his hands, that Emma truly looked at him for the first time. His face was strong and weathered, marked by lines of hardship around his eyes and mouth. But there was something else there too, a deep sadness that seemed to permeate his very being. When their eyes met, she saw a flicker of pain so profound. It took her breath away. "These will be too big," he said, holding out the clothing, "but they're dry and warm. There's a screen in the corner if you want privacy to change." Emma accepted the garments gratefully, noting the careful way he avoided looking directly at her, the deliberate distance he maintained. She moved behind the wooden screen he'd indicated, stripping out of her ruined wedding dress with relief. The man's clothes were indeed too large, but they were clean and dry and blissfully warm. When she emerged, she found him standing with his back to her, staring out the window at the storm. "Thank you," she said softly, folding her wedding dress and setting it aside. The gesture felt symbolic, like putting away the last remnant of her old life. He turned toward her, and for a moment, his expression was unguarded, vulnerable in a way that spoke of profound loneliness. Then the shutters came down, and he busied himself with the coffee, pouring 2 cups with hands that were perfectly steady despite the emotional storm she'd glimpsed in his eyes. "Coffee will help warm you from the inside," he said, offering her a steaming mug. "Storm like this could last through the night. You're welcome to stay until it passes." Emma wrapped her hands around the warm cup, inhaling the rich aroma gratefully. "I don't even know your name," she realized suddenly. "You've saved my life, and I don't know what to call you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first hint of humor she'd seen from him. "Jake Morrison," he said simply. "And you?" "Emma Collins," she replied, then added impulsively, "I was supposed to be Emma Ashford as of this morning, but I found I couldn't go through with it." Jake's eyebrows rose slightly at this revelation, but he made no comment, simply nodded as if runaway brides were a common occurrence in his mountain retreat. The lack of judgment in his response was somehow more comforting than any words of sympathy could have been. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside while the fire crackled warmly between them. Emma found herself studying Jake covertly, noting the careful way he held himself, the way his eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if seeing something else entirely. There was a quality about him that spoke of a man who had withdrawn from the world, who had found these mountains and built a life of solitude among them. "Have you lived here long?" she asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Jake considered the question for a moment before answering. 3 years, he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Since after my wife died." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with pain and loss. Emma felt her heart constrict with sympathy, recognizing in his words the source of the sadness she'd seen in his eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Jake nodded, accepting her sympathy but not encouraging further discussion of the topic. Instead, he rose and moved to the stove, ladling soup from a pot that had been simmering there. "You need food," he said, changing the subject with obvious deliberation. "Mountain air and cold will drain you faster than you realize." The soup was simple but nourishing, thick with vegetables and meat, seasoned with herbs that Emma didn't recognize but which tasted of the wild places where they'd grown. She ate gratefully, feeling strength return to her body with each spoonful. Jake ate as well, but sparingly, his attention seeming to focus more on ensuring she had enough than on his own hunger. "Where were you headed?" he asked as they finished the meal. "The valley's a big place, and not all of it's safe for someone traveling alone. My brother Thomas has a farm there," Emma explained. "He wrote to me about starting fresh, about the opportunities in the mountains. When I decided I couldn't marry William, Thomas seemed like my only hope for a different kind of life." Something flickered across Jake's face at the mention of Thomas's name. There and gone so quickly Emma wasn't sure she'd seen it. "Thomas Collins," he said, and it wasn't a question. Emma's heart leaped with hope. "You know him? Is he well?" "I haven't heard from him in weeks, and I was beginning to worry." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire, and when he looked back at her, Emma saw something in his expression that made her blood turn cold. "Miss Collins," he said gently, I'm afraid I have some difficult news about your brother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure the weight of Jake's words settled over Emma like a shroud, and she felt the warmth of the cabin suddenly drain away, replaced by a cold that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup, the ceramic clinking against the wooden table with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "What kind of news?" she whispered, though every instinct told her she didn't want to hear the answer. Jake's face was carved from stone, his eyes holding a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked almost like guilt. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the storm as if the answers he sought might be written in the driving rain. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low Emma had to strain to hear it over the fire's crackling. "Thomas is dead, Miss Collins. He died 3 weeks ago." The words hit Emma like physical blows, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her gasping. The room seemed to tilt around her, and she gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. "No," she said, the word barely more than a breath. "No, that can't be true. He was fine when he wrote to me. He was building something. He was happy." Jake turned back to face her, his expression etched with sympathy that somehow made the news even more devastating. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. I know this isn't what you expected to hear when you came looking for him." Emma's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible information. Thomas dead? Her brother, her protector, her only hope for a new life? The future she'd envisioned, the sanctuary she'd fled toward, collapsed around her like a house of cards. In a hurricane. "How?" she managed to ask, though the word felt like broken glass in her throat. "There was an accident at the mine," Jake said carefully. "A cave-in. Thomas was trapped along with 2 other men. By the time they dug them out." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Emma understood perfectly what he wasn't saying. She doubled over in her chair, a keening sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. The grief hit her in waves, each one more devastating than the last. Thomas, who had always been her champion, who had stood between her and their father's coldness, who had promised her a place in his new world, was gone. The last thread connecting her to hope, to family, to any kind of future, had been severed. With brutal finality, Jake moved toward her hesitantly, his own pain evident in every line of his body. "Miss Collins, I know this is a shock. If there's anything I can do, leave me alone," Emma sobbed, the words torn from the depths of her anguish. "Please, just leave me alone." But Jake didn't retreat. Instead, he knelt beside her chair, his presence steady and somehow comforting despite her request for solitude. "You don't have to face this by yourself," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose someone who meant everything to you. The pain feels like it might kill you, but somehow, you keep breathing anyway." Emma looked up at him through her tears, seeing her own devastation reflected in his eyes. "Your wife?" she whispered, understanding flooding through her grief. "You lost your wife." Jake's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Emma thought he might withdraw, might retreat behind the walls of silence he'd erected around his own sorrow. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Sarah," he said, the name falling from his lips like a prayer. "We'd been married 4 years when the fever took her. She was everything good in my world." The simple confession, delivered with such raw honesty, pierced through Emma's self-absorbed grief and made her truly see the man before her. Jake Morrison wasn't just a mountain hermit who had offered her shelter. He was a fellow traveler on the road of loss, someone who understood the particular devastation of having your future ripped away without warning. "I came up here afterward," Jake continued, his voice distant with memory. "Couldn't stand to be around people, around the life Sarah and I had planned together. These mountains don't judge, don't offer false comfort, don't expect you to be anything other than what you are. Sometimes that's all a person can handle." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some semblance of composure. "What am I going to do?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than her immediate circumstances. With Thomas gone, she had nowhere to turn, no one to protect her from the consequences of her rebellion. Her father would never take her back, not after the humiliation she'd caused. William Ashford certainly wouldn't want a bride who had publicly rejected him. She was truly alone in the world, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of coins that wouldn't last a week. "You'll survive," Jake said with quiet certainty. Because that's what people do when they have to. They find a way to keep going, even when they can't see how. But where? Emma pressed. I can't go back to Richmond. After what I did, I'm as good as dead to my family. And I can't support myself. I was raised to be decorative, not useful. I don't know how to do anything that matters. Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made Emma feel exposed, as if he could see directly into her soul. You made it this far through mountains that have killed stronger people than you, he said finally. You escaped a life that would have slowly strangled everything real inside you. That takes more courage than most people ever find. Don't sell yourself short. Jake rose from where he'd been kneeling beside Emma's chair, his movements deliberate and controlled, like a man who had learned to contain powerful emotions through sheer force of will. The firelight cast shadows across his weathered features, highlighting the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and solitary grief. He moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the cabin, withdrawing something that caught the orange glow of the flames. This belonged to Sarah, he said, his voice rough with unspoken memories as he returned to Emma's side. In his hands was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless handlings. She kept notes about everything: recipes, remedies, ways to preserve food, how to tend a garden. She was practical in ways that kept us alive up here. Emma accepted the journal with trembling fingers, feeling the weight of another woman's life contained within its pages. As she opened it, Sarah Morrison's careful handwriting revealed itself, each entry a testament to the knowledge and skills that had sustained a marriage in the wilderness. There were instructions for making soap from wood ash and animal fat, techniques for smoking meat to last through the winter, detailed notes about which wild plants could heal and which could kill. I can't take this, Emma whispered, though her eyes continued to devour the precious information written in fading ink. This is all you have left of her. Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a flash of pain crossing his features before he controlled it. Sarah would have wanted it to help someone who needed it, he said firmly. She never could stand to see suffering if she had the power to prevent it. Reading her words might give you the practical knowledge you think you lack. Emma traced a finger along one of Sarah's recipes for cornbread, imagining the woman who had written these careful instructions, who had lived in this cabin and loved the man now standing before her. Tell me about her, she said softly, surprising herself with the request. What was she like? For a moment, Jake's carefully constructed walls seemed to crumble, revealing the depth of loss that lay beneath his controlled exterior. He sank into the chair across from Emma, his eyes growing distant as memory took hold. She was small, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Barely came up to my shoulder, but she had a strength in her that could move mountains when she set her mind to something. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, and when she laughed, he trailed off, lost in recollection. She came out here with you willingly? Emma asked, trying to imagine a woman choosing this isolated existence. It was her idea, Jake said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. We met in Richmond, actually. I was working construction after the war, trying to find my place in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Sarah was a seamstress, supporting herself and her elderly aunt after her parents died. She had dreams of owning land, of building something that belonged to her. The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Emma. Another woman fleeing the limitations of conventional life, seeking freedom in the wilderness. How did you convince her to come to such a remote place? I didn't have to convince her, Jake replied, his eyes focusing on Emma with sudden intensity. She convinced me. I was content to drift, to take whatever work I could find, never putting down roots. But Sarah had vision. She saw what this valley could become, imagined the life we could build here together. Emma felt a pang of envy for the love story she was hearing, for the partnership that had been cut short by cruel fate. She must have been remarkable. She was everything I never knew I needed, Jake said simply. Strong enough to split wood when I was laid up with a broken leg, gentle enough to nurse a wounded bird back to health, stubborn enough to argue with me when I was being foolish. She made this place a home instead of just a shelter. The raw honesty in his voice broke something loose in Emma's chest, a recognition of the profound loneliness that bound them together despite their different circumstances. Here was a man who had known deep love and lost it, who had retreated to these mountains to nurse wounds that might never fully heal. And here she was, a woman who had fled from a loveless future only to discover that her refuge had been destroyed before she could reach it. How long has it been since you've spoken to anyone about her? Emma asked gently. Jake's hands stilled on the table between them, his knuckles white with tension. 3 years, he admitted. I haven't talked about Sarah to another living soul since the day I buried her. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Emma realized that she was witnessing something extraordinary, a man breaking his self-imposed silence, sharing his most guarded memories with a stranger who had stumbled into his carefully ordered solitude. The weight of that trust was both humbling and terrifying. She sounds like someone worth remembering, Emma said carefully, sensing the fragility of the moment. She is, Jake corrected, his voice firm despite the emotion threading through it. She is worth remembering. That's why I've stayed up here, why I've kept everything exactly as she left it. If I move on, if I let go, then it's like she never existed at all. Emma heard the pain in his words, the desperate clinging to memory that she recognized from her own losses. But she also heard something else, a question buried beneath his certainty, a crack in the foundation of his grief that suggested he might be ready to examine his choices. Is that what she would have wanted? Emma asked softly. For you to stop living because she couldn't? Jake's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, but when he spoke, his voice was controlled. You don't understand what it's like to lose someone who was part of your very soul. When Sarah died, half of me died with her. The half that knew how to hope, how to plan for tomorrow, how to see beauty in anything beyond these four walls. You're right, Emma admitted. I don't understand that kind of love. I've never had it. But I understand loss, and I understand the temptation to stop moving forward when the future seems impossible to face. She thought of Thomas, of the plans they'd made in their letters, the dreams that had sustained her through the nightmare of her engagement to William. My brother and I used to write to each other about the life we'd build when I could join him here. He described this valley like it was paradise, a place where we could both be free from the expectations that had trapped us back east. Now that he's gone, it feels like those dreams died with him. Jake studied her face in the firelight, seeing something there that made his expression soften slightly. But you're still here, he pointed out. You still made the journey, still fought your way through mountains and storms to reach this place. That suggests something stronger than just dreams. Emma considered his words, feeling their truth resonate somewhere deep in her chest. Maybe, she conceded, or maybe I just didn't know what else to do. Sometimes running away is easier than staying to face the consequences. And sometimes, Jake said quietly, staying in one place is easier than facing the possibility of building something new. The admission cost him something. Emma could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, in the careful way he avoided her eyes. But he had spoken the truth, and they both knew it. They were both refugees from grief, both trapped by their different responses to loss. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the hammering rain softening to a steady patter against the cabin's walls. Emma became aware of how late it had grown, how the initial shock of learning about Thomas's death had given way to this strange, intimate conversation with a man she'd known for mere hours but who felt somehow familiar, as if grief had created a common language between them. I should let you rest, Jake said, seeming to sense her exhaustion. You've had more than enough shock for one day, and the mountains will still be here tomorrow when you're stronger. Emma nodded, though she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. There was something healing about speaking honestly with someone who understood loss, who didn't try to offer empty comfort or false reassurances. Where should I sleep? Jake gestured toward a small alcove she hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by a curtain. That was Sarah's sewing corner, he said. There's a narrow bed there that she used when she worked late into the night. It's not much, but it's private and warm. The thought of sleeping in a dead woman's space should have been unsettling, but somehow it felt appropriate, as if Sarah Morrison's presence still lingered in the cabin, offering comfort to another woman in need. Emma gathered the journal Jake had given her, holding it against her chest like a talisman. Thank you, she said, the words encompassing far more than just the offer of shelter. For everything. For saving my life, for telling me about Thomas, for sharing your memories of Sarah. I know none of it was easy. Jake nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Get some rest, Miss Collins. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. Emma made her way to the alcove, drawing the curtain behind her for privacy. The space was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in quilts that still smelled faintly of lavender. Sarah's sewing supplies were arranged neatly on a small table, spools of thread catching the reflected firelight from the main room. As Emma settled into the bed, Sarah's journal open on her lap, she found herself thinking about the woman who had once occupied this space, who had sewn by lamplight while her husband worked or read nearby. There was something deeply moving about the domesticity of it, the quiet partnership that had existed in this remote cabin. She began to read Sarah's entries more carefully, discovering not just practical instructions, but glimpses into a life lived with purpose and joy despite its hardships. Sarah wrote about the first wildflowers of spring, about teaching Jake to braid her hair, about her plans for expanding their garden. Between the lines, Emma could read the story of a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection, something she had never witnessed in her parents' cold, formal union. May 15th, 1882, one entry read. Jake brought me wild roses today, a whole armload of them that he picked from the ridge behind the cabin. He was embarrassed about the gesture, said he knew they'd die quickly, but I told him that was what made them precious. Beautiful things don't have to last forever to be worth having. Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she read the words, understanding something about Jake's grief that he might not even recognize himself. He was trying to preserve something that had never been meant to be preserved, holding on to memories so tightly that he couldn't see the beauty that still existed around him. From the main room came the soft sounds of Jake banking the fire, preparing the cabin for the night. Emma found herself listening to his movements, cataloging the routine of a man who had lived alone for too long. There was a precision to everything he did, an economy of motion that spoke of someone who had streamlined his existence to its bare essentials. She thought about his confession earlier, about how he hadn't held a woman since Sarah's death. The admission had been delivered so matter-of-factly, but Emma understood the profound isolation it represented. Jake Morrison had shut himself off from human touch, from the comfort that physical closeness could provide, as if allowing himself such solace would somehow betray his wife's memory. Emma closed the journal and settled deeper into the quilts, her mind churning with everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had fled one life only to discover that the refuge she'd been seeking no longer existed. Thomas was dead. Her future was uncertain, and she was entirely dependent on the kindness of a stranger who was clearly wrestling with his own demons. But despite the tragedy and uncertainty, Emma found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. A sense of authenticity that had been missing from her carefully controlled life in Richmond. Here in this mountain cabin, sleeping in a dead woman's bed while a grieving widower stood guard against the night, she was finally free to be herself without pretense or performance. The storm continued to diminish outside, and Emma drifted toward sleep listening to the rain's gentle rhythm. In her dreams, she found herself walking through a garden where autumn roses bloomed impossibly bright, while somewhere in the distance, two voices called to her, one familiar and beloved, the other still learning how to hope again. When Emma woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the small window of the alcove, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted from the main room, along with the sound of Jake moving quietly about his morning routine. For a moment, Emma lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the events of the previous day. Then memory returned in a rush. Thomas's death, her desperate flight from Richmond, the storm that had driven her to seek shelter with a man who was as lost as she was. Emma sat up slowly, every muscle in her body protesting the previous day's ordeal. Through the curtain, she could hear Jake working at the stove, the domestic sounds both comforting and strange after so many months of tension and uncertainty. She dressed quickly in the clothes Jake had lent her, then emerged from the alcove to find him standing at the window, a cup of coffee in his hands as he gazed out at the transformed landscape. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with moisture. Steam rose from the wet earth, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the early morning light. "Good morning," Emma said softly, not wanting to startle him. Jake turned toward her, and Emma was struck by how different he looked in the daylight. The harsh lines of grief were still etched in his face, but there was something else there too, a subtle softening that suggested their conversation the night before had affected him as much as it had her. "Morning," he replied, his voice gravelly. "With sleep. Coffee's fresh, and there's breakfast if you're hungry." Emma accepted the cup he offered, wrapping her hands around its warmth as she joined him at the window. The view was breathtaking, rolling mountains stretching to the horizon, clothed in the brilliant colors of early autumn. In the distance, she could see smoke rising from what must be the settlement of Millbrook, the only sign of human habitation in the vast wilderness. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it completely. "I can see why Sarah loved this place." Jake's expression grew thoughtful as he followed her gaze. "She used to stand here every morning, planning what she wanted to accomplish that day. Said the mountains reminded her that some things were worth the effort it took to build them." Emma heard the wistfulness in his voice, the echo of dreams that had been cut short by fate. "What did she plan to build?" "Everything," Jake said. "Simply. A larger garden, maybe some fruit trees, eventually a few head of cattle. She wanted to turn this into a real homestead, something that could support a family." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "We talked about children, about raising them to love this place the way she did." The confession hung between them, heavy with lost possibilities. Emma felt her heart ache for the man beside her, for the future that had been stolen from him along with his wife. But she also felt something else, a growing understanding of why Jake had chosen isolation over the risk of building something new. "She sounds like she had wonderful dreams," Emma said carefully. "She did," Jake agreed. "But dreams need more than one person to make them real. After she died, I couldn't see the point in continuing something that had been ours together." Emma set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully, seeing the pain and confusion that warred in his expression. "What if the dreams were bigger than just the two of you?" she asked gently. "What if Sarah wanted to build something that could outlast even her own life?" Jake's eyes met hers, and Emma saw a flicker of something that might have been hope before he looked away. "It doesn't matter now," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm not the same man I was when she was alive. I don't know how to hope anymore, how to plan for anything beyond getting through each day." "Maybe that's enough for now," Emma said. "Maybe getting through each day is where hope begins." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the mist rise from the valley below as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Emma found herself thinking about her own future, about the choices that lay ahead of her now that Thomas was gone and her old life was impossible to reclaim. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she said finally. "About surviving because it's what people do when they have to. I need to find a way to support myself, to build some kind of life here." Jake turned toward her, his expression serious. "The valley's not an easy place for a woman alone," he said bluntly. "The work is hard, the winters are harsh, and there aren't many people willing to take a chance on someone without experience." "But there might be some," Emma pressed. "People who need help, who would be willing to teach me what I need to know." Jake considered this for a moment, his practical mind clearly working through the possibilities. "There's the pastor and his wife in Millbrook," he said slowly. "Samuel and Ruth Hayes. They've been looking for someone to help with the church. And the school, someone who can read and write well. It doesn't pay much, but it might be a start." Emma felt a spark of hope at the suggestion. "You think they might consider me, despite my unusual circumstances?" "The Hayes are good people," Jake said. "They judge others by their actions, not their past. If you're willing to work hard and learn, they might be willing to give you a chance." The possibility opened up before Emma like a door she hadn't known existed. It wasn't the life of ease and privilege she'd been raised to expect, but it was something real, something she could build with her own efforts. "Would you introduce me to them?" Jake hesitated, and Emma could see the internal struggle playing out in his expression. Helping her would mean leaving his isolated cabin, venturing back into the world of human interaction he'd been avoiding for 3 years. It would mean taking a step away from the grief that had become his constant companion. "I suppose I could," he said finally. "It's been too long since I've checked on them anyway. Samuel helped me with Sarah's burial, and I never properly thanked him for his kindness." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the gesture, understanding what it cost him to make such an offer. "Thank you," she said simply. "I know this isn't easy for you." Jake nodded, his expression distant as he contemplated the journey ahead. "We'll leave after breakfast," he said. "The trail down to Millbrook is treacherous when it's wet, but it should be passable by midday." As they shared their simple meal, Emma found herself studying Jake with new appreciation. He was doing something extraordinary, reaching beyond his own grief to help a stranger in need, even when that help required him to face the very world he'd been hiding from. The gesture spoke to a fundamental decency that his isolation hadn't been able to destroy, a core of goodness that Sarah's love had nurtured and that still existed despite his loss. The breakfast was simple but substantial: eggs from chickens Jake kept in a small coop behind the cabin, bacon he'd cured himself, bread that was dense and filling, if not elegant. As they ate, Emma asked questions about the practical aspects of mountain life, and Jake answered them with patient detail, sharing knowledge that Sarah had once taught him. "The key to surviving up here," he explained, "is to think ahead, to prepare for problems before they happen. Winter comes early and stays late, so you need enough food and fuel to last from October to April. The growing season is short, so every day of good weather has to count." Emma listened carefully, storing away every piece of information. This was knowledge she would need if she was going to make a life in this valley, practical wisdom that no amount of formal education could replace. "How did you and Sarah learn all this?" she asked. "Trial and error, mostly," Jake admitted with something that might have been amusement. "Our first winter, we nearly starved because we hadn't preserved enough food. Sarah swore we'd never be caught unprepared again, and she made sure we weren't." The mention of his wife brought the familiar shadow to Jake's eyes, but it was softer now, tinged with fondness rather than raw anguish. Emma recognized the shift as significant, a sign that their conversation the night before had begun some kind of healing process. After breakfast, Jake prepared for their journey to Millbrook with the same methodical care he brought to everything else. He checked his horse's hooves, adjusted the saddle, packed supplies for the trip. Emma watched him work, noting the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency, the way he anticipated problems and solved them before they could develop. "Are you ready?" he asked finally, turning toward her with an expression that was both determined and apprehensive. Emma nodded, clutching Sarah's journal against her chest like a talisman. "As ready as I can be." Jake helped her mount his horse, then swung up behind her as he had the night before. But this time, the contact felt different, charged with an awareness that hadn't existed during their desperate flight from the storm. Emma found herself acutely conscious of his warmth, of the strength in the arms that surrounded her as he took the reins. They rode down the mountain trail in silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape unfolded around them. The storm had transformed everything, washing the world clean and bringing out colors that seemed impossibly vivid in the morning light. Despite the uncertainty of her future, Emma felt something stirring in her chest that she barely recognized as hope. "I haven't held a woman since my wife died," the mountain man confessed to the Lost Bride Part 3, Brief Connection and Departure. The settlement of Millbrook emerged from the valley mist like something from a children's storybook, its modest collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central dirt road that meandered alongside a crystal-clear creek. Smoke rose from chimneys and straight columns, and Emma could see people moving about their morning routines, tending gardens, feeding livestock, carrying on the business of living in this remote corner of the world. As they rode closer, Emma became aware of the curious stares that followed their progress down the main street. A woman in men's clothing, riding behind Jake Morrison, who hadn't been seen in town for months, was clearly an event worthy of speculation. She felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, acutely conscious of how inappropriate her situation must appear to these mountain folk with their strong sense of propriety. Jake seemed oblivious to the attention they were attracting, his focus entirely on navigating toward a small white church that stood at the far end of the settlement. The building was simple but well-maintained, with a modest steeple and windows that caught the morning light like welcoming eyes. Beside it stood a smaller structure that Emma assumed must be the parsonage. They dismounted in front of the church, and Jake tied his horse to a hitching post with movements that spoke of long familiarity with the routine. Emma smoothed her borrowed clothes nervously, trying to make herself more presentable, though she knew there was little she could do about her unconventional appearance. Pastor Hayes is probably in the church this time of morning, Jake said, his voice carrying a tension that Emma hadn't heard before. He likes to spend time there alone before the day begins. Emma nodded, following Jake up the wooden steps to the church's front door. He knocked once, a solid sound that echoed in the morning quiet, then opened the door without waiting for a response. The interior of the church was as simple as its exterior, with plain wooden pews facing a modest altar topped by a rough-hewn cross. The morning light streaming through the windows created patterns of gold and amber on the floor. A man knelt at the altar rail, his gray head bowed in prayer. At the sound of their entrance, he turned, and Emma saw a face marked by kindness and intelligence, eyes that held both wisdom and genuine warmth. Pastor Samuel Hayes rose to his feet with the careful movements of someone well past middle age, but still strong in spirit. "Jake Morrison," the pastor said, his voice carrying surprise and pleasure in equal measure. "I was beginning to think the mountains had swallowed you whole." Jake's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and Emma could see the effort it cost him to engage in even this simple social interaction. "Pastor Hayes," he replied with a slight nod. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never," Samuel said warmly, his eyes moving to Emma with curious but non-judgmental interest. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Emma Collins," Jake said, his voice formal despite the intimate circumstances of their meeting. "She's Thomas Collins' sister." Something shifted in Pastor Hayes' expression at the mention of Thomas's name, a shadow of sadness crossing his features. "Miss Collins," he said, gently, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss. Your brother was a good man, well respected in our community." Emma felt the familiar stab of grief at the reminder of Thomas's death, but she managed to maintain her composure. "Thank you, Pastor Hayes. I've come to see if there might be opportunities for me here in the valley." The pastor's eyebrows rose slightly at this, and Emma could see him taking in her unusual attire, the circumstances of her arrival with Jake, the obvious signs of someone who had traveled far under difficult conditions. But his expression remained kind, non-judgmental, as if he were accustomed to people arriving at his door with complicated stories. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation at the house," he suggested. "Ruth will want to meet you, and she's much better than I am at discussing practical matters." They followed Pastor Hayes to the parsonage, a comfortable two-story house with a wraparound porch and flower boxes that spoke of a woman's caring touch. The interior was warm and welcoming, filled with books and comfortable furniture that had been chosen for use rather than display. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, making Emma's stomach growl despite their recent breakfast. Ruth Hayes appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands on a well-worn apron. She was a small, energetic woman with silver hair and bright blue eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her gaze took in Jake's presence with obvious pleasure, then moved to Emma with curiosity that was tempered by compassion. "Jake Morrison," she said, moving forward to clasp his hands in greeting. "What a wonderful surprise. And you must be Emma Collins. Samuel told me you might be coming to the valley, though we heard." She trailed off delicately, clearly not wanting to mention Thomas's death directly. "My brother died before I could reach him," Emma said simply, appreciating Ruth's tactful approach. "Now I find myself in need of making my own way in the world." Ruth's expression grew thoughtful as she studied Emma's face, seeing something there that seemed to satisfy her. "Well then," she said briskly, "let's have some coffee and discuss what that might look like." They settled around the kitchen table, Ruth bustling about preparing refreshments while Samuel and Jake made awkward conversation about weather and crops. Emma found herself watching the interplay between the three, noting how the pastor and his wife treated Jake with gentle warmth that never pushed or demanded, allowing him to engage at his own pace. "Jake tells me you might have work that would suit someone with my limited practical experience," Emma said when Ruth joined them at the table. Ruth exchanged a glance with her husband before answering. "We do need help with the school," she said carefully. "The woman who was teaching the children moved away last month to be with her married daughter, and we haven't been able to find a replacement." Emma felt a flutter of hope at the words. "I can read and write well," she said. "I had an excellent education, even if it wasn't particularly practical." "Can you manage children?" Samuel asked. There are 12 of them, ages 6 to 14, and some can be quite spirited. Emma thought of her experiences helping care for younger cousins during family gatherings, the only real interaction she'd had with children in her sheltered life. I believe so, she said honestly. I may not have extensive experience, but I'm willing to learn. Ruth and Samuel exchanged another look, one of those wordless communications that spoke of a long and successful marriage. The position includes room and board, Ruth said finally. There's a small apartment above the schoolhouse that was built for the teacher. It's not much, but it's private and comfortable. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the offer, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers who were willing to take a chance on her despite her unconventional circumstances. That's more than generous, she managed. What would I need to do? Teach the children to read and write and cipher, Samuel said. Help them with their letters and numbers, maybe. Tell them stories that might expand their understanding of the world beyond this valley. The mountain children are hungry for learning, Ruth added. They may not have much formal education, but they're intelligent and eager. You'd find them rewarding to work with. Emma looked across the table at Jake, seeing something in his expression that she couldn't quite interpret. There was approval there, and perhaps something that looked like relief, but also something else, something that might have been disappointment. When would I start? Emma asked, turning back to the haze. Immediately, if you're willing, Ruth said. The children have been without proper instruction for too long already. Emma nodded, feeling as though her life was suddenly falling into place in ways she couldn't have imagined. I would be honored to accept your offer. The next hour was spent discussing practical details, the curriculum Emma would be expected to teach, the supplies available to her, the expectations of the parents who would be entrusting their children to her care. Ruth showed her the schoolhouse, a single room with neat rows of desks and a blackboard that had seen better days, and the small apartment above it that would be her new home. The apartment was indeed modest, consisting of a main room with a small kitchen area, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed and dresser, and a tiny sitting area with a single window that looked out over the valley. But it was clean and private, with furniture that was simple but serviceable, and Emma found herself imagining how she might make it her own. It's perfect, she told Ruth honestly. More than I could have hoped for. As they returned to the parsonage, Emma noticed that Jake had grown increasingly quiet, his expression distant, as if he were withdrawing into himself. She wondered if the prospect of leaving her here was affecting him, or if the social interaction was simply becoming overwhelming for a man who had lived in isolation for so long. There's one more thing, Samuel said as they gathered in the kitchen again. The parents will want to meet you before they entrust their children to your care. We're having a community gathering tomorrow evening at the church. It would be a good opportunity for you to introduce yourself. Emma felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of facing an entire community, but she knew it was necessary. Of course, she said. I understand their need to know who will be teaching their children. Ruth reached across the table and patted Emma's hand gently. Don't worry, dear. Once they see your sincerity and dedication, they'll welcome you. This community values hard work and good character above all else. Jake rose abruptly from his chair, his movements sharp with sudden tension. I should be getting back, he said, his voice carefully controlled. The horse needs rest, and there are chores waiting. Emma felt a stab of something that might have been panic at his words. After everything they had shared, was he simply going to ride away and return to his solitary existence? Jake, she said, rising to follow him toward the door. Will I see you again? He paused with his hand on the doorknob, his back to her, and Emma could see the tension in his shoulders. The mountains aren't that big, he said finally. Paths cross when they need to. It wasn't really an answer, and they both knew it. Emma wanted to say more, to express her gratitude for everything he had done, to somehow convey how much their brief connection had meant to her. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by the awareness of how fragile his emotional state was, how easily he might retreat completely if pushed too hard. Thank you, she said instead, putting all the meaning she could into those simple words. For everything. Jake nodded without turning around, then opened the door and stepped out into the bright morning light. Emma followed him to the porch, watching as he untied his horse and prepared to mount. At the last moment, he looked back at her, and Emma saw a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been regret. Take care of yourself, Miss Collins, he said formally. The valley can be an unforgiving place for those who aren't prepared for its challenges. With that, he swung into the saddle and rode away, his figure growing smaller as he headed back toward the mountain trail that led to his isolated cabin. Emma watched until he disappeared entirely, feeling an unexpected sense of loss that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. "He's a good man," Ruth said quietly, appearing beside Emma on the porch. "Lost and hurting, but good at his core. Sarah's death nearly destroyed him." Emma turned to look at the older woman, seeing understanding and compassion in her weathered features. "You knew Sarah?" "We all did," Ruth replied with a sad smile. "She was like sunshine in human form, always bringing light wherever she went. Jake worshipped the ground she walked on, and she loved him just as deeply. When she died, it was like watching a man's soul break into pieces." Emma thought of the grief she had seen in Jake's eyes, the careful way he spoke of his wife, the isolated cabin where he kept everything exactly as Sarah had left it. "How long has he been living alone up there?" 3 years come winter," Ruth said. "Samuel and I have tried to reach out, to bring him back into the community, but he's built walls around himself that are hard to breach." Emma nodded, understanding more than she wanted to about the walls people built to protect themselves from further pain. "He helped me when I needed it most," she said. "I hope someday I might be able to return that kindness." Ruth's eyes grew thoughtful as she studied Emma's face. "Perhaps you already have," she said mysteriously. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply to remind them that connection is still possible." They spent the rest of the day settling Emma into her new quarters and preparing for her role as the valley's teacher. Ruth proved to be a font of practical wisdom, sharing insights about the children she would be teaching, the families they came from, the unique challenges of education in such a remote location. "The Fletcher boy has a gift for numbers," Ruth explained as they organized the school supplies. "But he struggles with reading because his eyes don't work quite right. Mary Wilson is bright as a penny but shy as a deer, won't speak up in class unless you draw her out carefully." Emma absorbed every detail, grateful for Ruth's guidance, but also excited by the challenge that lay ahead. For the first time in her life, she would be doing something meaningful, something that mattered beyond the narrow confines of social expectations and family obligations. As evening fell, Emma found herself standing at the window of her small apartment, looking out over the valley where lights were beginning to twinkle in cabin windows. Somewhere up in those dark mountains, Jake Morrison was alone in his cabin, surrounded by memories of the woman he had loved and lost. Emma pressed her hand against the glass, thinking of their brief time together, the way he had cared for her without expectation of reward, the glimpses she had caught of the man he might be if he could find his way past his grief. Their paths had crossed for less than 24 hours, but somehow that brief connection had changed something fundamental in both their lives. She thought of the way he had looked at her as he prepared to leave, the regret and longing she had seen in his eyes before he turned away. There had been something between them, fragile and unnamed, but real nonetheless, something that might have grown into friendship or perhaps something deeper if circumstances had been different. But Jake had chosen isolation, and Emma had chosen to build a new life in the valley below. Their paths had crossed when they both needed it most, but now they diverged again, carrying them in different directions toward uncertain futures. Still, as Emma prepared for bed in her new home, she found herself hoping that Ruth was right, that paths had a way of crossing again when they needed to. The mountain man had saved her life and helped her find her way to a new beginning. Perhaps someday, when his grief had softened enough to allow it, she might be able to help him find his way back to the world of the living. The next morning brought Emma's first real test as a teacher, and she woke before dawn with nervous energy coursing through her veins. Ruth had arranged for the children to come to school early so Emma could meet them individually before the community gathering that evening, a gesture of kindness that Emma deeply appreciated. The first child to arrive was Tommy Fletcher, a freckled boy of about 10 who regarded Emma with curious but cautious eyes. Ruth had been right about his gift for numbers. Within minutes of meeting him, Emma could see the quick intelligence that sparkled behind his shy demeanor. "Can you show me what you've been learning?" Emma asked, settling beside him at one of the small desks. Tommy nodded eagerly and began working through arithmetic problems with a speed and accuracy that impressed Emma. But when she asked him to read a simple passage, his confidence evaporated. and he struggled with words that should have been easy. For a child his age, Emma watched him carefully, noting the way he squinted at the page, the way he held the book at an unusual angle. "Tommy," she said gently, "when you look at the letters, do they ever seem to move around on the page?" The boy's eyes widened with surprise. "How did you know?" he whispered, as if admitting to some shameful secret. "Because I had a cousin who saw letters the same way," Emma said, though it wasn't entirely true. She had read about such conditions in one of the medical texts her brother had shared with her. "It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your mind. It just means we need to find a different way to help you learn." The relief on Tommy's face was heartbreaking, and Emma felt a fierce surge of protectiveness toward this bright child who had probably been struggling in silence for years. She made a mental note to research techniques that might help him, to find ways to adapt her teaching to accommodate his unique needs. One by one, the other children arrived, each bringing their own personality and challenges to the small schoolhouse. Mary Wilson was indeed as shy as Ruth had warned, barely speaking above a whisper despite Emma's gentle encouragement. The older children displayed a mixture of eagerness and skepticism, clearly testing this new teacher who had appeared so suddenly in their lives. By noon, Emma was exhausted but exhilarated. These mountain children were unlike any she had encountered in her sheltered Richmond upbringing. They were practical and self-reliant, curious about the world beyond their valley, but grounded in the realities of their harsh environment. They asked questions that challenged her, shared knowledge about their mountain home that humbled her, and looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than their years. "How did it go?" Ruth asked when Emma returned to the parsonage for lunch. "Wonderfully," Emma said, meaning it completely. "They're remarkable children, hungry for knowledge, but also wise in ways that formal education doesn't teach." Ruth smiled with satisfaction. "I thought you'd appreciate them once you got to know them. They're good children, raised by good people who understand the value of learning." That evening, the community gathering filled the small church to capacity. Emma stood at the front of the room, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes studying her with mixtures of curiosity, hope, and careful assessment. These were hard-working people who had entrusted their children to strangers before, only to be disappointed when teachers proved unprepared for the realities of mountain life. "My name is Emma Collins," she began, her voice stronger than she felt. "I know I'm not what you expected when you agreed to consider me for this position. I don't have years of experience or formal training in teaching. What I do have is a genuine love of learning and a deep respect for the children you've allowed me to meet today." She spoke about her plans for the school, her commitment to adapting her teaching to each child's needs, her hope of opening windows to the wider world while respecting the wisdom and traditions of their mountain community. As she talked, she could see some of the skepticism in the room beginning to soften, replaced by cautious optimism. When she finished speaking, there were questions, practical concerns about curriculum and discipline, testing queries designed to gauge her knowledge and dedication. Emma answered them honestly, admitting her limitations while demonstrating her willingness to learn and adapt. "What made you want to come here?" asked a weathered man Emma recognized as Tommy Fletcher's father. "This isn't an easy life for someone raised with city comforts." Emma thought of her flight from Richmond, of the storm that had driven her to Jake's cabin, of the series of events that had brought her to this moment. "I came here looking for something real," she said finally. "Something meaningful to do with my life. Your children have already shown me that I found what I was looking for." The honesty of her answer seemed to resonate with the assembled parents. One by one, they voiced their approval, their willingness to give this unexpected teacher a chance to prove herself. By the end of the evening, Emma felt she had been tentatively accepted into the community, welcomed not as an outsider doing them a favor, but as someone who might genuinely belong in their mountain valley. As the gathering dispersed and families headed home through the crisp autumn night, Emma found herself standing alone outside the church, looking up at the star-filled sky. The mountains rose around her like protective walls, and for the first time since fleeing Richmond, she felt a sense of peace that went deeper than mere relief. She thought of Jake in his lonely cabin, of the grief that kept him isolated from this warm community, of the brief connection they had shared that felt far more significant than the few hours they had known each other. Somewhere up in those dark peaks, he was probably sitting by his fire, surrounded by memories of the woman he had loved and lost. Emma made a silent promise to herself that night, standing beneath the mountain stars. She would build a good life here in the valley, would prove worthy of the trust these people had placed in her. And perhaps, someday, she would find a way to help Jake Morrison discover that life could still hold beauty and meaning, even after the deepest loss. The mountain man had saved her when she was lost and desperate. Now it was her turn to find a way to save him, even if he didn't yet know he needed saving. Winter came early to Blue Ridge Valley that year, sweeping down from the peaks with a ferocity that caught even the seasoned mountain folk by surprise. Emma had been teaching for 6 weeks when the first serious snow began to fall, transforming the world outside her schoolhouse windows into a crystalline wonderland that took her breath away. The children pressed their faces against the glass, their excitement palpable as they watched fat flakes drift past like pieces of heaven broken loose. Miss Collins called Sarah Beth Morrison, a bright-eyed 8-year-old who shared a name with Jake's deceased wife. "Will we still have school if it keeps snowing like this?" Emma looked at the accumulating snow, already ankle-deep and showing no signs of stopping. "We'll have school as long as it's safe for you to travel here," she said. "But some days, the mountains will make that decision for us." The words proved prophetic. By the next morning, snow had piled 3 feet deep against the schoolhouse door, and the wind howled down from the peaks with such violence that Emma could barely see the church across the road. One by one, parents arrived to collect their children, apologizing for the early dismissal but unwilling to risk their safety against the storm's growing fury. Emma found herself alone in the schoolhouse as the blizzard intensified, listening to the wind shriek around the building's corners like something alive and angry. She climbed to her small apartment above the classroom, grateful for the wood stove that kept her space warm, but increasingly concerned about her dwindling supply of fuel. She had been so focused on preparing lessons and getting to know her students that she hadn't properly prepared for the harsh reality of mountain winter. The pile of split wood behind the schoolhouse, which had seemed adequate when the weather was mild, now looked pitifully small against the prospect of weeks of bitter cold. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping Emma in her small apartment with nothing but books for company and increasingly meager supplies of food. She rationed her remaining provisions carefully, melting snow for water and burning furniture when her firewood ran dangerously low. On the 3rd night, as she huddled beneath every blanket she owned, feeding pages from old magazines to the dying fire, Emma began to understand how quickly the mountains could turn deadly for the unprepared. It was during that long, cold night that she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood, rhythmic and purposeful despite the continuing storm. Emma pressed her face to the frost-covered window, trying to see through the swirling snow, but visibility was nearly zero. The sound continued for over an hour, steady and determined, before finally stopping. When morning came and the storm finally began to subside, Emma opened her door to find a miracle. Someone had split and stacked enough firewood to last her through the rest of winter, arranging it neatly under the schoolhouse's small covered porch. Fresh supplies sat beside the wood, flour and preserved meat and other necessities wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect them from the weather. There was no note, no sign of who had braved the storm to ensure her survival, but Emma's heart knew the truth even as her mind struggled to accept it. Jake Morrison had somehow made his way down from his mountain cabin through the worst blizzard anyone could remember, had worked through the night to provide for her needs, then disappeared, again without seeking thanks or acknowledgement. The realization brought tears to her eyes, not just from gratitude, but from understanding what his gesture meant. Jake had been watching over her from his distant retreat, had known she was in danger, and risked his own life to help her. The mountain man who claimed to have withdrawn from all human connection had revealed the depth of his caring through actions that spoke louder than any words. When school resumed the following week, Emma threw herself into her teaching with renewed dedication, determined to prove worthy of the second chance Jake's intervention had given her. The children noticed the change in her, the new intensity and passion she brought to their lessons, though they had no idea what had inspired it. Tommy Fletcher continued to struggle with reading despite Emma's best efforts to help him, but his mathematical abilities grew stronger each day. Mary Wilson gradually began to open up, sharing stories about the mountain wildlife she observed with a naturalist's keen eye. The older children challenged Emma with questions about the world beyond their valley, hungry for knowledge that would help them understand their place in the larger scheme of things. As winter deepened and the holidays approached, Emma found herself thinking more and more about Jake alone in his cabin, surrounded by memories and grief. She asked Ruth Hayes about mountain traditions, about ways the community had once tried to reach out to him. "We used to invite him for Christmas dinner every year," Ruth said sadly. Sarah loved the holidays, always insisted on having everyone who had nowhere else to go. After she died, Jake stopped coming. Samuel still extends the invitation, but Jake never responds. Emma had an idea then, something that would honor Sarah's memory while perhaps offering Jake a different way to connect with the living. She spent weeks preparing, working with the children to create something special, something that might reach past the walls of grief Jake had built around himself. On the last day of school before the Christmas break, Emma dismissed the children early and set out on snowshoes Ruth had loaned her, carrying a carefully wrapped bundle up the mountain trail toward Jake's cabin. The journey was treacherous, the path barely visible beneath deep snow, but Emma was determined to make this pilgrimage. She found Jake splitting wood in the yard behind his cabin, his movements efficient despite the bitter cold. He looked up at her approach with surprise and something that might have been alarm, as if her presence in his sanctuary threatened the careful balance he had maintained. "Miss Collins," he said, setting down his axe and wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing temperature. "What brings you up here in such weather?" Emma pulled the bundle from her pack, unwrapping it carefully to reveal a hand-sewn quilt, made from scraps of fabric the schoolchildren had contributed. Each piece told a story, cut from outgrown clothes or beloved blankets, stitched together with love and hope by young hands guided by Emma's patient instruction. "The children made this," she said, holding out the quilt. "They wanted to give you something for Christmas, something to thank you for the wood and supplies. They don't know it was you, but I do, and I told them about a lonely man who might need to know he's remembered." Jake stared at the quilt as if it were something dangerous, his hands remaining stubbornly at his sides. "I can't accept that," he said finally. "It's too much. It's a gift freely given," Emma replied gently. Sarah's journal says she believed beautiful things didn't have to last forever to be worth having. The children put their hearts into this work. Don't you think she would want you to accept their kindness? Something flickered across Jake's face at the mention of his wife, pain mixed with something that might have been longing. "You've been reading Sarah's journal," he said, not making it a question. "Every day," Emma admitted. "Her words have taught me more about living in these mountains than any formal instruction could." She was remarkable, Jake. The love she had for this place, for the life you built together, shines through every entry. Jake's composure cracked slightly, his careful control wavering. "She was everything good in my world," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When she died, the light went out of everything. I don't know how to live in a world that doesn't have her in it." Emma stepped closer, still holding the quilt between them like an offering. "Maybe the answer isn't learning to live without her," she said softly. "Maybe it's learning to live in a way that honors what she gave you, what she would have wanted for you." "And what would that be?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and feared it. "Connection," Emma said simply. "Love. The courage to build something beautiful even knowing it might not last forever. Sarah didn't love you because she thought you'd both live forever. She loved you because the time you had together was precious precisely because it was limited." Jake took the quilt then, his hands trembling slightly as he held the colorful patchwork against his chest. Emma could see the war playing out in his expression, the desperate desire to retreat into safe isolation battling against a growing recognition that his grief had become a prison. "I don't know how," he whispered, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I don't know how to hope again, how to care about anything when it can all be taken away so suddenly." Emma reached out then, covering his hands with hers where they clutched the quilt. The contact sent electricity through both of them, the first human touch Jake had experienced in 3 years, the first time Emma had reached out to comfort someone rather than seeking comfort herself. "You start small," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "You accept a gift from children who wanted to brighten your Christmas. You remember that Sarah loved this community, these people, and maybe try to see them through her eyes. You take one day at a time and let yourself feel whatever comes, even when it hurts. Jake's eyes met hers, and Emma saw something breaking open behind his careful walls, like ice cracking under the pressure of a spring thaw. "Emma," he said, her name falling from his lips like a prayer. "I haven't held a woman since my wife died. I haven't wanted to, haven't thought I ever would again. But standing here with you." He didn't finish the sentence, didn't need to. Emma could see the truth in his eyes, the recognition of something growing between them that neither had expected or planned. It wasn't the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more precious, the possibility of love born from shared understanding of loss and the courage to risk caring again. "I know," Emma said softly. "I feel it too. Whatever this is between us, it doesn't diminish what you had with Sarah. Love isn't a finite resource, Jake. Having room in your heart for new feelings doesn't mean there's less space for the old ones." Jake set the quilt carefully aside and stepped closer to Emma, his hands rising to frame her face with infinite gentleness. "She would have liked you," he said, wonder in his voice. "Sarah would have seen the strength in you, the kindness. She would have wanted me to find someone like you." Emma leaned into his touch, feeling the rightness of the moment despite its unexpectedness. "Then maybe that's permission enough?" she whispered. When Jake kissed her, it was with the desperate hunger of a man who had been starving without realizing it, but also with the reverence of someone who understood the preciousness of human connection. Emma kissed him back with all the love she had been saving for a future she thought would never come, pouring her heart into the contact between them. They broke apart eventually, breathing hard in the cold mountain air, both overwhelmed by the intensity of what had just happened. Jake rested his forehead against Emma's, his eyes closed as if he were afraid to open them and find this was all a dream. "What happens now?" Emma asked, voicing the question they were both thinking. Jake opened his eyes, and Emma saw something there she had never seen before, a flicker of hope struggling to kindle into flame. "Now we take it one day at a time," he said, echoing her earlier words. "We see if this feeling can grow into something real, something that honors both what we've lost and what we might gain." Emma nodded, understanding that this was the beginning of something, not the end. They would need time to navigate the complex emotions surrounding Jake's grief and their growing attraction. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, the need to build trust and understanding between two people who had both been wounded by life. But as they stood together in the snow outside Jake's cabin, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her brother's letters had first offered her hope of escape from Richmond. She felt the possibility of a future worth having, a life built on genuine connection rather than social obligation. "Come to Christmas dinner at the Hayes," she said impulsively. "Not for me, but for Sarah, because she loved bringing people together, and because the community needs to see that healing is possible." Jake considered this for a long moment, his practical mind clearly wrestling with the implications. Appearing at a community gathering would signal his return to the world of the living, would invite questions and attention he had been avoiding for 3 years. "All right," he said finally, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did Emma. "For Sarah, and maybe a little bit for you." Emma smiled then, the expression transforming her face with radiant joy. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough to start with." 2 days later, Jake Morrison walked into the Hayes parlor, carrying the quilt the schoolchildren had made him, his presence causing a momentary hush before conversations resumed with careful normalcy. Emma watched from across the room as Ruth Hayes embraced him with tears in her eyes, as Pastor Hayes gripped his hand with obvious emotion, as the community that had missed him welcomed him back with the gentle restraint that respected his journey. Throughout the evening, Emma caught Jake's eyes across the crowded room, saw him struggling with the overwhelming nature of social interaction after so long in isolation. But she also saw him making the effort, speaking with neighbors about crops and weather, accepting condolences for Sarah's death with grace rather than withdrawal. When the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Jake approached Emma with something that looked like uncertainty in his expression. "Walk with me?" he asked, and Emma nodded, gathering her cloak. They walked through the snow-quiet streets of Millbrook, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. Above them, stars shone with crystalline clarity in the mountain sky, and Emma felt the peace of the season settling around them like a blessing. "Thank you," Jake said as they paused outside the schoolhouse. for pushing me to come tonight, for making me remember what it feels like to be part of something larger than my own grief." Emma looked up at him, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the broken hermit he had been. "Thank you for being brave enough to try," she replied. "Sarah would be proud of you tonight." Jake's smile was soft and genuine, the first truly unguarded expression Emma had seen from him. "I think she would be proud of you too," he said. "For building a life here, for taking care of the children, for seeing something worth saving in a broken man." "You were never broken," Emma said, firmly. "Wounded, grieving, lost, yes, but never broken. Tonight proved that." As Jake prepared to return to his cabin, he hesitated, clearly wanting to say something more. "Emma," he began, then stopped, searching for words adequate to what he was feeling. "I know," Emma said gently, understanding without needing explanation. "We have time, Jake. All the time we need to figure out what this is between us." He nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Good night, Emma Collins," he said formally, but his eyes held warmth that made her name sound like an endearment. "Good night, Jake Morrison," she replied, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away toward the mountain trail. Spring came early to Blue Ridge Valley that year, arriving with a rush of snowmelt and wildflowers that transformed the landscape almost overnight. Emma found herself thinking of Sarah's words about beautiful things not needing to last forever, to be worth having, understanding now what the other woman had meant. Jake began visiting the settlement regularly, sometimes helping with repairs at the church, other times simply sitting quietly in the back during Emma's lessons. The children accepted his presence without question, as children do, and Emma watched him slowly rediscover the joy of being useful, of contributing to something beyond his own survival. Their courtship, if it could be called that, was gentle and unhurried, built on shared conversations rather than stolen kisses, on understanding rather than passion. They talked about Sarah often, about Thomas, about the different ways grief had shaped them both. Emma learned about Jake's years as a soldier, about the dreams he and Sarah had shared, about the man he was slowly remembering how to be. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch of the schoolhouse watching the sun set behind the mountains, Jake took Emma's hand in his, intertwining their fingers with careful reverence. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice carrying an odd mixture of nervousness and determination. They rode up to his cabin together as they had so many times before, but this time Jake led her to a small clearing behind the house, where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion. In the center of the clearing stood a simple wooden cross marking Sarah Morrison's grave, but surrounding it was something Emma had never seen before. Jake had planted a garden, not the practical vegetable plots that sustained life, but something purely beautiful, filled with flowers that would bloom in waves throughout the growing season. Roses climbed a trellis he had built, while daffodils and tulips promised spring color. Summer lilies waited to unfold, and autumn asters would provide color when the world began to turn again toward winter. "Sarah always wanted a flower garden," Jake said quietly. "Something just for beauty, not for practical purposes. I could never see the point when we had so much work to do just surviving. Now I understand what she meant about making room for beauty alongside necessity." Emma walked among the planted rows, seeing not just flowers but the evidence of healing, of a man learning to create rather than simply endure. "It's magnificent," she said, meaning it completely. "She would love it." "I hope so," Jake said, joining her in the center of the garden. "I built it for her, but also for me. For us, maybe, if you think you could be happy living here." Emma turned to face him, seeing the question in his eyes that he hadn't quite been able to voice. "Are you asking me to marry you, Jake Morrison?" "I am," he said simply. "Not to replace Sarah, not to fill some empty space she left behind, but to build something new, something that honors what we've both learned about love and loss and the courage it takes to hope again." Emma looked around the garden, at the cabin that had sheltered her in her darkest hour, at the mountains that had become home in ways she never could have imagined. This wasn't the life she had planned when she fled Richmond, but it was real and meaningful in ways her old existence never could have been. "Yes," she said, the word carrying all the love and hope and determination she possessed. "Yes, I'll marry you." When Jake kissed her then, it was with the passion of a man who had learned not to take love for granted, and Emma responded with the fervor of a woman who had finally found where she belonged. Around them, The flowers nodded in the mountain breeze, and somewhere in the eternal blue of the mountain sky, Emma felt the blessing of two souls who had loved well and would want nothing more than for love to bloom again in the place they had called home. The wedding took place in midsummer, in the church where Emma taught, and before the community that had welcomed them both back to the world of the living. Emma wore a simple dress that Ruth Hayes had helped her sew, and Jake stood at the altar, in his best suit, his eyes bright with happiness that no one who knew him could have imagined possible just months before. Pastor Hayes performed the ceremony with obvious joy, speaking of second chances and the miracle of love that grew from understanding rather than mere attraction. The children from Emma's school sang, their voices soaring toward the rafters like prayers made audible. And when it was over, when the promises had been made and the blessing given, Jake and Emma Morrison rode up the mountain trail toward their home, toward the cabin where they would build a life together, toward the garden where beauty and memory would bloom side by side in the high mountain air. Years later, when Emma was gray-haired and Jake walked with the careful gait of age, they would still tend Sarah's garden together, adding new varieties and colors while maintaining the original plantings that had marked the beginning of their healing. Children and grandchildren would play among the flowers, learning from their elders that love was not diminished by being shared, that the heart's capacity for caring was infinite if one had the courage to keep it open. And on quiet evenings, when the mountain air was soft and the stars shone clear, Emma would sometimes catch Jake gazing thoughtfully at Sarah's grave, not with the anguish of early grief, but with the gentle sadness of loving remembrance. She never interrupted these moments, understanding that his ability to honor his first love had made it possible for him to embrace his second, that some flowers needed the richness of old soil to bloom their brightest. The mountain man had saved a lost bride, but in the end, they had saved each other, finding in their shared understanding of loss the foundation for a love that would endure all the seasons the mountains could send their way. 5 years had passed since Emma and Jake Morrison's wedding day, and the mountain cabin had transformed into something that bore little resemblance to the austere hermitage Jake had maintained during his years of grief. Children's laughter echoed through rooms that had once known only silence, and the practical additions Emma had suggested had turned the simple structure into a proper family home. Their twin daughters, Sarah May and Rose Elizabeth, now 3 years old, tumbled through the enlarged living space like whirlwinds of energy and curiosity. Sarah May had inherited her father's dark hair and serious demeanor, while Rose bore Emma's auburn locks and adventurous spirit. Between them, they had turned Jake Morrison from a man who barely remembered how to smile into someone whose face lit up the moment his daughters appeared. Emma stood at the kitchen window, watching Jake teach the twins to identify different bird calls in the early morning light. His patience with them was infinite, his love so obvious it sometimes took her breath away. The man who had once believed himself incapable of caring again had become the most devoted father she could have imagined. "Papa, Papa," Rose called, pointing excitedly at a red cardinal perched on the fence post. "Pretty bird." "That's right, little Rose," Jake said, lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see better. "And what sound does the cardinal make?" Rose attempted a whistling sound that bore no resemblance to any bird call ever heard in nature, while Sarah May giggled from her perch in Jake's other arm. The domestic scene filled Emma with such contentment that she almost didn't notice the rider approaching through the morning mist until he was nearly at their gate. The man was well dressed in the manner of city folk, his clothes expensive but impractical for mountain travel. His horse showed signs of hard riding, and there was something in the stranger's posture that spoke of urgency, perhaps even desperation. Emma felt an old familiar tension grip her chest, the instinctive wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Jake had noticed the rider as well, setting down the twins and moving protectively closer to the house. The years of peaceful domesticity hadn't entirely erased his soldier's instincts, and Emma could see him assessing the stranger with the careful attention of a man who had learned to recognize potential threats. "Good morning," the rider called as he dismounted. "I'm looking for Mrs. Emma Morrison, formerly Miss Emma Collins of Richmond." Emma stepped onto the porch, Jake moving to stand beside her with one hand resting casually on the rifle that was never far from reach. "I'm Emma Morrison," she said calmly. "And you are?" "Charles Whitmore." The man replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. I'm an attorney from Richmond, representing the estate of your late father, Theodore Collins. Emma felt the world tilt slightly around her. Her father dead? The man who had disowned her for fleeing her wedding, who had refused all contact. For over 6 years was gone. My father died? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months ago, Whitmore confirmed, his expression sympathetic. I apologize for the delay in reaching you. Your family wasn't certain of your whereabouts, and it took considerable effort to trace you to this location. Jake moved closer to Emma, offering silent support as she struggled to process this news. Theodore Collins had been a cold, distant father even before her rebellion, but he was still the man who had raised her, who had given her the education that now served her well as a teacher. His death, even after years of estrangement, left a hollow ache in her chest. Why have you come? Emma asked, forcing herself to focus on practical matters rather than the complex emotions swirling through her mind. Whitmore reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio. Your father left specific instructions regarding your inheritance, he said. Despite the circumstances of your departure from Richmond, you remain his daughter and heir to a considerable portion of his estate. Emma stared at the attorney as if he had spoken in a foreign language. Inheritance. But I thought he disowned me. Publicly, yes, Whitmore admitted. Your father was a proud man who couldn't forgive what he saw as your betrayal of the family name. But privately, he never changed his will. You stand to inherit the Richmond house, significant financial assets, and controlling interest in your father's shipping business. The enormity of what Whitmore was saying began to sink in. Emma's father had been a wealthy man, his shipping empire one of the most successful in Virginia. The inheritance he described would make her one of the richest women in the state, would open doors to a life of luxury and influence that most people could never imagine. There are conditions, of course, Whitmore continued. The will stipulates that you must return to Richmond to claim your inheritance, must take an active role in managing the business affairs, and must. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with this next part. Must agree to certain social rehabilitations that would restore the family's reputation. Emma felt Jake's tension increase beside her, understanding without words what such conditions would mean. Returning to Richmond would mean leaving their mountain home, abandoning the community they had helped build, separating Jake from Sarah's grave and the garden that had marked his healing. What kind of social rehabilitations? Jake asked, his voice carefully controlled, but carrying an edge that Whitmore couldn't miss. The attorney glanced between them nervously. The family feels that Mrs. Morrison's reputation could be restored through appropriate charitable work, social connections, and perhaps, he swallowed hard, perhaps through a marriage that would be more acceptable to Richmond society. The implication hung in the air like poison. Emma's family wanted her to return to their world, to abandon her mountain husband in favor of someone who would enhance rather than diminish their social standing. The sheer audacity of the suggestion left Emma speechless with rage. Are you suggesting, Jake said with deadly calm, that my wife abandon her marriage and children to satisfy the social pretensions of people who disowned her for choosing love over duty? Whitmore raised his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm merely conveying the terms of the will, sir. I take no personal position on their merit or morality. Emma found her voice thin, the anger burning away her shock and grief. You can tell my family that I declined their generous offer, she said with icy precision. I have everything I need right here. Mrs. Morrison, Whitmore said urgently, perhaps you don't understand the magnitude of what you're refusing. The inheritance amounts to over $200,000, plus properties and business interests worth considerably more. You would be financially independent for life, able to provide for your children's education and future in ways that— he gestured vaguely at their mountain surroundings. In ways that would be impossible here. Emma looked around at the home she and Jake had built together, at the garden where roses bloomed beside Sarah's grave, at the mountains that had sheltered and nurtured them through the hardest parts of their lives. She thought of her students in the Valley School, of the community that had welcomed her when she had nothing, of the life she had constructed from love and determination rather than inherited privilege. You're wrong, Mr. Whitmore, she said firmly. I understand exactly what I'm refusing and exactly what I would be giving up to accept it. The answer is no. The attorney made one final attempt. Perhaps you could take some time to consider? Discuss it with your husband? The family would be willing to negotiate certain terms if it meant securing your return. No negotiation is necessary, Jake said, his voice carrying the finality of a man who had made his decision. My wife has given you her answer, and I support it completely. We have no interest in a fortune that comes with chains attached. Whitmore nodded reluctantly, gathering his papers and preparing to remount his horse. Very well. I'll convey your decision to the family. The inheritance will pass to your cousin Margaret, though I suspect they'll contest your refusal in court. Let them, Emma said with a shrug. I left that world behind long ago, Mr. Whitmore. I have no intention of returning to it now. After the attorney rode away, Emma and Jake stood together on their porch, watching his figure disappear into the morning mist. The twins had wandered off to play in the garden, their voices carrying on the mountain air like birdsong. Do you regret it? Jake asked quietly, turning down that kind of wealth? The opportunities it would have given the girls? Emma considered the question seriously, looking out over the valley that had become her world. What opportunities? She asked finally. The chance to be decorative objects in someone else's plans? To marry for advantage rather than love? To live lives constrained by what other people think is appropriate? She turned to face her husband, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes despite his supportive words. Jake, do you think I chose poorly? Do you think our daughters would be better off in Richmond parlors than running free in these mountains? Jake's expression softened as he pulled her into his arms. I think our daughters are the luckiest children in the world, he said firmly. They have parents who love them completely, a community that values them for who they are rather than what they own, and freedom to become whatever they choose to be. Emma leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. Besides, she added with a smile, we're already rich. We have everything that matters. The truth of her words became evident over the following weeks as life in the valley continued its familiar rhythms. Emma returned to her teaching with renewed appreciation for the privilege of shaping young minds, of seeing children discover the joy of learning without the pressure of social expectations that had constrained her own childhood. Jake threw himself into preparations for winter with characteristic thoroughness, but also with a contentment that spoke of a man who had found his proper place in the world. He worked on expanding their cabin further, adding a proper study where Emma could prepare lessons and write the letters she had begun sending to other isolated communities, sharing teaching techniques and educational resources. The twins thrived in their mountain environment, developing the kind of practical intelligence and emotional resilience that would serve them well regardless of what paths they chose in life. Sarah May showed an early aptitude for numbers and engineering, building elaborate structures from blocks and stones with the same methodical precision her father brought to everything he did. Rose displayed a naturalist's curiosity about the world around her, collecting specimens and asking questions that challenged even Emma's extensive education. One evening in late autumn, as they sat by the fire after putting the girls to bed, Emma found herself thinking about the road not taken, about the life she might have lived if she had accepted her family's offer. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had said yes? She asked Jake, who was working on a wooden toy he was making for Rose's upcoming birthday. Jake set down his carving knife and considered the question carefully. I wonder sometimes, he admitted, but not with regret. I think about how different you would have become, living in that world again. How the Emma I fell in love with might have disappeared under layers of social expectation and family pressure. Emma nodded, understanding what he meant. I would have become someone else entirely, she said. Someone who looked like me but had lost everything that made me who I am. And our girls, Jake added quietly, would have grown up thinking that love was something you traded for advantage, that happiness was less important than respectability. Emma reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become second nature over their years together. I made the right choice, she said with absolute certainty. Whatever challenges we face here, whatever hardships we endure, we face them as ourselves, as a family bound by love rather than obligation. Jake raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I love you, Emma Morrison, he said simply. Not for what you gave up to be here, but for who you chose to become. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, unusual enough at this hour to make them both alert. Jake rose to answer it, revealing Pastor Hayes standing in the lamplight with an expression of barely controlled excitement. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late," Samuel said, "but I have news that couldn't wait until morning." A letter came on the evening stage, addressed to the community. "We're being offered a chance to establish a proper academy, with funding from the territorial government." Emma sat up straighter, her teacher's instincts immediately engaged. "What kind of academy?" Samuel stepped inside, accepting Jake's offer of coffee as he explained. "A secondary school that would serve all the mountain communities within a day's ride. Higher education for the older children, teacher training for young people who want to serve other isolated areas, maybe even courses for adults who want to improve their reading and mathematics." The possibilities unfolded in Emma's mind like flowers opening to sunlight. She had often worried about her brightest students, about the limited opportunities available to them once they outgrew her small schoolhouse. An academy would change everything, would give mountain children access to education that rivaled anything available in the cities. What would this mean practically? Jake asked, his mind already working through the logistics. "They want to build it here in Millbrook," Samuel explained. "The community would need to provide land and some local funding, but the territorial government would supply most of the resources. They're looking for someone to serve as headmaster, someone with both teaching experience and deep roots in the community." Emma felt her heart begin to race as the implications became clear. This was an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams, a chance to build something lasting that would benefit generations of mountain children. But it would also require enormous commitment, long hours, and responsibilities that would challenge her in ways she had never been tested. "They're offering the position to you, Emma," Samuel said, confirming what she had already begun to suspect. "Your reputation as a teacher has spread beyond this valley. The Territorial Education Board has heard about your work with the children here, about the innovative methods you've developed for teaching in isolated communities." Emma looked at Jake, seeing support and pride in his expression despite the demands such a position would place on their family life. "What do you think?" she asked him. "I think," Jake said slowly, "that this is why you were meant to come to these mountains. Not just to escape the life you didn't want, but to build something better than anything you could have inherited." Emma felt tears prick her eyes at his words, at the recognition that her journey from Richmond runaway to mountain teacher had led her exactly where she was meant to be. "We need to expand the house," she said practically, her mind already racing ahead to the challenges they would face. "I'd be away from home more, working longer hours. The girls would need to understand that their mother's work was important not just to our family, but to the entire community. The girls will grow up seeing their mother as a woman who builds institutions, who changes lives, who makes a difference in the world," Jake said firmly. "That's not a burden, Emma. That's a gift." Over the following months, the Academy project consumed most of Emma's waking hours, but she had never been happier or more fulfilled in her work. The territorial government proved generous with funding, and the mountain communities rallied together with donated labor and materials that turned the ambitious plans into reality with remarkable speed. Jake proved instrumental in the construction, his carpenter's skills and natural leadership making him an invaluable coordinator for the volunteer work crews. The twins spent their days playing among the construction materials, absorbing lessons about cooperation and community effort that no textbook could provide. By the spring of their 6th year in the mountains, the Blue Ridge Academy stood complete, a handsome 2-story building with classrooms, laboratories, a library, and dormitory facilities for students who lived too far away to commute daily. Emma walked through the empty halls in the weeks before opening, marveling at how far she had come from the desperate bride who had fled Richmond with nothing but the clothes on her back. The Academy's opening ceremony drew visitors from across the territory, government officials and educators who wanted to see this experiment in mountain education. Emma stood before the assembled crowd, looking out at faces that represented the community she had come to love, the families who had trusted her with their children's futures. "Education is not about escaping your origins," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "It's about understanding them so completely that you can choose what to keep and what to change. These mountains have taught me that the most valuable inheritance is not what you receive, but what you build with your own hands and give to the next generation. She spoke about the unique challenges and opportunities of mountain life, about the importance of preserving traditional knowledge while opening doors to broader understanding. She talked about the students who would study here, young people who would carry their mountain values into whatever futures they chose, whether that meant staying in the valley or venturing into the wider world. When the ceremony ended and the visitors had departed, Emma found herself alone in the academy's main classroom, surrounded by the tools and books that would shape young minds for generations to come. Jake appeared in the doorway, the twins balanced on his shoulders as they often were these days. "How does it feel?" he asked, setting down the girls so they could explore their mother's new domain. Emma looked around at the classroom, at the blackboard where she would write lessons that might inspire the next generation of teachers, doctors, engineers, or simply thoughtful citizens who would make their communities better places to live. "It feels like home," she said simply. Jake crossed the room to embrace her, and Emma marveled again at the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened bride who had fled an unwanted marriage had become a woman who built schools and shaped futures. The grieving widower, who had retreated to a mountain cabin, had found new purpose in love and community. "Mama," Rose said, tugging at Emma's skirt, "is this where we'll go to school when we're big?" Emma knelt to her daughter's level, looking into eyes that sparkled with the same curiosity that had driven Emma's own quest for knowledge. "If you want to," she said. "But remember, the most important education happens everywhere, not just in classrooms. Your father can teach you about building things with your hands. The mountains can teach you about patience and persistence, and your community can teach you about the importance of caring for each other." Sarah May, always more serious than her twin, studied the classroom with calculating eyes. "Will you teach us, Mama, like you teach the other children?" "Every day," Emma promised. "Whether we're in this classroom or in our kitchen or walking in the woods. Learning never stops, sweetheart. It just changes shape." As they walked home together in the evening light, Emma thought about the letter from Charles Whitmore that had arrived just that morning. Her cousin Margaret was indeed contesting Emma's refusal of the inheritance, claiming that a woman living in such primitive conditions could not be considered mentally competent to make such decisions. Emma had laughed when she read the legal challenge, showing it to Jake over their morning coffee. "They think I'm mentally incompetent," she said with amusement rather than anger. "Well," Jake had replied with a grin, "you did choose to marry a hermit and live on a mountain. Some might question your judgment." The truth was that Emma felt no regret about her choice, no second thoughts about the fortune she had refused. The academy opening had shown her clearly what her real inheritance was, the legacy she was building not with her father's money, but with her own intelligence, determination, and love. That night, after the twins were asleep and the dishes cleaned, Emma and Jake sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The lights of Millbrook twinkled in the valley below, each one representing a family they had come to know and care about over their years in the mountains. "Do you think we made the right choices?" Emma asked, a question that had become something of a ritual between them during quiet moments. Jake considered seriously, as he always did. "I think we made the only choices we could live with," he said finally. "We chose love over convenience, community over wealth, purpose over prestige. Whether that makes us wise or foolish, I suppose history will judge." Emma leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of his presence. "I think it makes us free," she said. "Free to be who we really are, free to build something meaningful, free to love without conditions or calculations." In the distance, an owl called from the woods behind their cabin, its voice echoing off the mountain walls that had sheltered and shaped them both. Emma thought of Sarah Morrison, buried in the garden where roses bloomed eternal, and felt a deep gratitude for the woman whose love had prepared Jake to love again. She thought of her brother Thomas, whose letters had first called her to these mountains, and knew that he would be proud of the life she had built in the valley he had loved. She thought of her father, stern and distant, but ultimately unable to completely disinherit the daughter who had disappointed him, and felt a complex mixture of grief and forgiveness. Most of all, she thought of the future spreading out before them like an uncharted map, filled with possibilities they could never have imagined when they first met in the midst of a mountain storm. Their daughters would grow up free to choose their own paths, educated and confident, rooted in love but not limited by geography. The academy would touch hundreds of lives, creating ripple effects that would spread far beyond the Blue Ridge Valley. "I have everything I ever wanted," Emma said into the star-filled darkness. "Everything I never knew I wanted, and everything I was afraid to hope for." Jake's arm tightened around her, his presence warm and solid in the mountain air. "So do I," he said simply. "So do I." Years later, when the Blue Ridge Academy had become famous throughout the territory for the quality of its graduates, when former students had gone on to become doctors and lawyers and teachers themselves, Emma would still remember this night as the moment when she understood completely that she had chosen correctly. The mountain man who had confessed he hadn't held a woman since his wife died had learned to love again, deeper and richer for his understanding of loss. The lost bride who had fled an unwanted marriage had found not just a husband, but a purpose that would outlast them both. Together, they had built something more valuable than any inheritance, more lasting than any fortune, more beautiful than any society drawing room. They had built a life of meaning in a place where love could grow wild and free, where children could learn to see the world clearly, where two wounded souls had discovered that healing was not just possible, but could become the foundation for something extraordinary. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.